One of the many things that makes The Lord of the Rings so special, I think, is the way that it subverts and challenges our ideas about heroism and about the role of the protagonist. By the standards of any other fantasy novel, particularly post-Tolkienian fantasy novels, we have three obvious candidates for the role of hero of the story. Frodo, who humbly and willingly undertakes this great quest to save the world. Sam, who supports Frodo and endures equally great hardship not just because the world needs to be saved, but because of his specific and personal loyalty to and love for Frodo. And of course Aragorn, the returning king, chieftain of the Dunedain, heir to Isildur's throne. And all three of these characters could, arguably, be read as the hero of the piece. Each one would deserve his spot on the cover, looking into the middle distance with nobility and determination, with the Tower of Barad-dûr in the background, probably holding a cool sword or a frying pan. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we consider heroes and heroism in The Lord of the Rings, and we have a lot of examples to consider because this kind of epic fantasy story has heroes to spare of every possible kind, except right at the heart of the story, heroes don't work the way that they usually do. Aragorn, for example, is physically challenged throughout the book. He is presented with obstacles which must be overcome, but distinguishing here between the book and the Peter Jackson movie adaptation, he doesn't have much of a character arc. He's awesome and noble on page 100, and he's awesome and noble on page 1100, and that's not a complaint or even a weakness in the book. God knows, not everybody has to have a character arc in the traditional sense. But a fundamental part of who Aragorn is within Tolkien's philosophical framework depends on him not having an arc. Aragorn is a good king, which isn't something that you arrive at or decide to be, it's something you are. So he is revealed by the story, discovered by Tolkien during the writing of the story. We learn more as we progress, but he doesn't really change past the climax of his introduction. Quote, "He stood up and seemed suddenly to grow taller. In his eyes gleamed a light, keen and commanding. Throwing back his cloak, he laid his hand on the hilt of a sword that had hung concealed by his side. They did not dare to move. Sam sat wide-mouthed, staring at him dumbly. 'But I am the real Strider, fortunately,' he said, looking down at them with a face softened by a sudden smile. 'I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, and if by my life or death I can save you, I will.'" End quote. Nobility, martial power, even an offer of service to those who need it. Plus, he's like really tall. So who even needs an arc? Sam, likewise, doesn't really arc. Or if he does, it's almost imperceptible, and deliberately so. It ends with a little bit of the magic of the world of elves safely enfolded into his hobbitish life. His great virtue is that he remains constant, that he carries the spirit of the Shire into the depths of Mordor and emerges with it intact. If anything, emerges with it stronger, because now he has more context for how special the Shire and its place in history really are. And Frodo? Well, Frodo is an enigma. We begin with him, and he's our POV character for much of the opening of the story, but then he slowly drifts away as the ring lures him further and further from the narrative focus, leaving us with Sam's account of what Frodo is going through, of what they are facing through the hardest part of their journey. We go some way toward externalizing Frodo's inner turmoil into the character of Gollum, who of course has his own inner turmoil externalized into the Gollum-Smeagol duality, the slinker and the stinker, as Sam has it. Frodo carries the greatest burden, his is the greatest sacrifice, but he also doesn't arc, at least in the traditional sense. Instead, what transformation we see in Frodo is the transformation of trauma, of having been broken by his burden, of having, ultimately, failed. More on that in a moment. And a slight tangent here. If you believe that Gollum is, to some degree, the externalized form of the influence of the ring over Frodo, a metaphor for that inner conflict, then we have to consider the way in which Sam reacts to Gollum, and possibly even question the limits of Sam's loyalty to his master, which is a thought that I don't like having, and I don't imagine you do either. I'll also note that this tension between Frodo and the temptation of the ring is an external pressure applied to him throughout the book, rather than an internal conflict, the kind of internal conflict that might generate a convincing character arc. Frodo doesn't seem to have, besides a couple of lines of dialogue in the first couple of chapters, much internal tension. He doesn't seem to be caught, as Bilbo was, between Baggins and Took. Frodo's mother was Primula Brandybuck, of course, but his maternal grandmother was Mirabella Took, the younger sister of Bilbo's mother, Belladonna Took. We don't get the same kind of tension between home and the wild, or the hill and the mountain, or prose and poetry as we get from Bilbo in the pages of The Hobbit. Frodo is already more comfortable existing in both worlds, largely, we should note, thanks to Bilbo's influence when we meet him. So there's no arc there either. And it isn't the case that Tolkien was naive or didn't understand how heroes are supposed to work in orthodox fiction, or that he didn't like the knightly heroic archetype. He clearly understands the appeal of that classic hero, the valiant soul who undertakes a great quest and leaves home behind and earns wisdom and power and overcomes the obstacle and then returns. But the examples that we get are either a long way from the core of the story or have some kind of asterisk attached. Éomer, for example, comes through the Red Day, the Sword Day, and the death of Theoden to become a wise, good king. Éowyn learns to set aside her desire for battle and glory and to embrace a role as a healer, a gardener, alongside Faramir. That, by the way, means that Éowyn gets one of the best, clearest arcs in the entire book. Boromir, we might argue, earns a wisdom and a peace in the moments right before his death, though that one is a little more speculative. At least his death, if tragic, is also heroic, following the command of his king. But there are, of course, in addition to all of these heroes, two absolutely classic heroic figures, fulfilling every aspect of the archetype right there on the page in front of us. We basically start with them, and we basically end with them, and I'm referring, of course, to Meriadoc Brandybuck and Peregrine Took, who, through their courage and nobility of spirit, earn power and wisdom and return home greater than they were, physically greater, thanks to the Entdrafts, but also greater in spirit, greater in rank. As we're told in the last chapter of The Return of the King, quote, Merry and Pippin lived together for some time at Crickhollow, and there was much coming and going between Buckland and Bag End. The two young travellers cut a great dash in the Shire with their songs and their tales and their finery and their wonderful parties. Lordly, folk called them, meaning nothing but good, for it warmed all hearts to see them go riding by with their mail shirts so bright, their shields so splendid, laughing and singing songs of faraway. And if they were now large and magnificent, they were unchanged otherwise, unless they were indeed more fair-spoken and more jovial and full of merriment than ever before. End quote. Classic hero's journey. Go out a little naive, a little untested, possessed of good heart but not much experience, face down the dangers of the world, make some mistakes, gain more power and knowledge, and return home better than you were before. Though, even in this case, Tolkien is stressing the fact that if they are less hobbitish on the outside, they are, if anything, more hobbitish on the inside, more fair-spoken, more jovial, more full of merriment. It isn't the role of a hobbit to feel the pain of the world. That's more of an elf thing. In this way, as in so many others, we see that Frodo, burdened as he is, leaves the Shire behind long before he actually leaves the Shire behind. And I think it's significant that Tolkien places Merry and Pippin in the periphery of the story, or at least in the periphery of the audience's interest, right? Merry takes the lead in the scouring of the Shire, and Pippin's military leadership is critical to their success at the Battle of Bywater, but even then, I think we're focused on Frodo, this quiet, uncertain, shaken version of Frodo, and the dauntless working-class sense of Samwise Gamgee. Merry and Pippin are great characters and get great, traditionally heroic arcs. But they aren't the focus of The Lord of the Rings, though even in-universe their heroism is evident. Think of them leaving Sam on the last page of The Return of the King, having held their silent vigil all the way back from the Grey Havens. Then Sam turns to climb the hill, and Merry and Pippin ride off singing into a different kind of story. So maybe, just maybe, the reason that we can't easily identify the heroic archetype at the heart of the story is that Tolkien is doing something very different, something much more adult. In a 1963 letter to Eileen Elgar, this is letter 246, Tolkien writes, quote, Frodo undertook his quest out of love, to save the world he knew from disaster at his own expense if he could, and also in complete humility, acknowledging that he was wholly inadequate to the task. End quote. Tolkien then notes that though he personally believes that Frodo succeeded in the task which he undertook to the degree that success was possible, and that Gandalf and Aragorn think the same, Frodo believes in the end that he failed, and that breaking of his spirit is as responsible as the Morgul blade and the sting of Shelob and the burden of the ring for his leaving Middle-earth. And that thought of Frodo failing, or believing that he has failed, is difficult to reconcile with the fact that he makes the 3 most heroic choices in the entire book. He takes up the ring at Bag End, he takes up the ring during the Council of Elrond, and he chooses to go on alone at Parthgallen. He doesn't make these choices because they are a duty that has been placed on him. He doesn't make these choices because he thinks he will succeed. He isn't prioritizing his own personal relationships, which I think is something that we might say is true of Sam, who consistently cares less about the fate of the world than he does about Frodo. Rather, Frodo is humbly submitting himself to the need of the world with little hope of success and no hope of reward or even return. Frodo's choice to sacrifice himself is immense, and he makes it 3 times over, each time without an offer of support or company. In the first instance, in Bag End, he says to Gandalf, quote, "And I suppose I must go alone if I am to do that and save the Shire. But I feel very small and very uprooted and, well, desperate. The enemy is so strong and terrible." End quote. Then, chapters later in the Council of Elrond, he says, quote, "I will take the ring," he said, "though I do not know the way." End quote. And he says that with no guarantee that anyone will agree to go with him, or even an expectation of support. Amid the great and the powerful of Middle-earth, Frodo is the one who takes up the burden without complaint. And then again, at Parthgallen, when Sam thinks his way through the problem and he finds Frodo invisible at the boats, Frodo says eventually, quote, "Now, Sam," said Frodo, "don't hinder me. The others will be coming back at any moment. If they catch me here, I shall have to argue and explain, and I shall never have the heart or the chance to get off. But I must go at once. It's the only way." End quote. Even here, Frodo is, again, taking up the burden himself, not because he believes himself to be strong, but because he knows in this instance that he is too weak to withstand the opposition of the rest of the Fellowship if they return. In each case, he chooses, though he believes he won't succeed, to do what is right, to do what is necessary. These are quiet moments, set apart from conflict and bloodshed. But in these moments, Frodo demonstrates a strength of will and a comparable humility that exceeds any other that we encounter. Sam comes closest, I would argue, taking the ring from the dead Frodo in Cirith Ungol, as he believes, but not only is that choice made easier by the fact that Sam believes Frodo to be dead, I don't think we can imagine him taking the ring to Mount Doom if Frodo had been captured, for example, but Sam then turns around at the first suggestion that Frodo has survived Shelob's poison. And I don't say this to take anything, believe me, anything away from Samwise Gamgee, but Tolkien clearly intends us to read a distinction between doing what we think is possible and doing what we think is impossible. And the reason that's important, of course, is that choosing to do the impossible demands of us a hope that exceeds ourselves, not a certainty, not a strategy, not a calculated risk, but a belief in the light that shines only in the darkest places, a belief in eucatastrophe. It is a surrender to the will of the universe, to the will of Ilúvatar. And you'll remember, perhaps, the segment in last week's show where I discussed the importance of free will and deontological ethics, the belief that the morality of any deed can be found in the decision, not in the consequence. Well, and here we are with Frodo, who made the hardest decisions for all the right reasons, without a kingdom to whom he is responsible, without a beloved master to guide him, alone and hopeless. Frodo made the right choice over and over. And if that isn't heroism, I don't know what is. This week, I have been the fortunate recipient of a flurry of correspondence. Please do keep it coming. I really love receiving all of your emails and Instagram DMs and Blue Sky DMs and all the good ways that you have to get in touch with me. You can find the show at Shire Reckoning Pod on Instagram and on Blue Sky, or you can email me directly, shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. This week, I have selected 2 questions which may not seem as though they're connected, but secretly are, which is the kind of ironic foreshadowing that you will only fully appreciate when you listen to this episode for a second time with a different reading strategy in mind. Sarah writes to ask, quote, "You've described your approach to The Hobbit as being a kind of reading strategy, and I'm not sure what you mean. Are you reading it differently this time?" End quote. And Karina asks, quote, if I were to undertake the journey to read all of the books, which reading order would you recommend? End quote. So let's begin with the first question first. At its simplest level, a reading strategy is just a means of describing what you are paying attention to as you read the book. Maybe you're here for the details of the plot. Maybe you're here for backstory and setting and world building, or the poetry of the prose, or one particular character, or one particular relationship, one particular theme. Maybe you are reading quickly, glossing the content of the book, just trying to get a feel for it. Maybe you're reading very deeply, trying to wring every ounce of meaning out of every single line. We all read books in different ways for different reasons, and a reading strategy just describes the position that you are adopting relative to the text. Meanwhile, the book is trying to orient you into the reading strategy that the author intended. When I say, as I so often do, that books teach you how to read them, this is what I mean. Books will lead your attention to what is important and will encourage you to adopt the strategy that the author imagined that their preferred reader would actually have. Yes, the author might be saying, this is a fluffy billionaire romance, so don't worry about the actual economics or the world building or the paperwork and bookkeeping. Or the author might say, this is magical realism, so pay particular attention to symbols and motifs as we move through. I am an artist, so pay close attention. I am an entertainer, so just go with it. And this is important, so let's take a moment to emphasize it. No reading strategy, fresh out of the box, is better or worse than any other. They're just a way of getting you what you want out of the text. Hopefully, this will also be what the author intended to give you, and you will have a great experience. Close reading, for example, is a reading strategy. Reading historically or biographically is a reading strategy. Choosing to ignore history and biography and reading in a vacuum is a reading strategy. And a good example of how reading strategies can shift is the common experience of finishing a series and then going back to the first book and reading it again. This time you are inevitably in a different position. You have a different perspective. From this informed position, you know what is coming and you're seeing the connections form on the page in front of you. That is a different reading strategy. Your attention is focused differently. The rewards are different. When we're reading critically, though, sometimes we'll adopt a particular reading strategy that doesn't even necessarily seem to fit the book organically, just to see what happens. What happens if we read Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter books as commentaries on personal liberty and oppressive, rapacious imperialism? What if we read Agatha Christie's Poirot novels as depictions of repressed homosexuality in the 1950s? What if we read the Narnia books and really try to figure out the politics and the economics of Lewis's world? This, incidentally, leads to the most exhausting kind of internet content generation, in which every standard, stock, cliched interpretive move can be and will be applied to every single text in existence, regardless of applicability. Boom, you have got an infinite source of YouTube content. Oh, do you think that the protagonist of this book or movie or TV show has been dead the whole time? You are convinced that this secondary character, who may exhibit unusual wisdom or plot-relevant guidance for the protagonist, is actually only a product of the protagonist's imagination? You think that the protagonist and antagonist of every single story secretly have some familial relationship? Everyone's been dead the whole time? Gilmore Girls is actually set in the Matrix? Buffy was really in that psychiatric hospital? Secretly, the good guys are the bad guys and the bad guys are the good guys? M. Night Shyamalan has a lot to answer for, is what I'm saying. I wouldn't be me if I didn't point out that you as a reader are also a product of history and experience and time. So the person that you are now, perhaps returning to a book that you've already read or picking up the sequel to a book that you've already read, the person that you are now is not the same as the person that you were when you first formed your opinions on this text. That doesn't invalidate those initial feelings. The you that was really experienced those feelings. But there's an element of chance involved in returning to a book or a fictional world. You might love it less. You might suddenly see flaws and ideology under the surface, or you might love it more, discovering new perspectives that enrich the experience. Any experience of reading a book is the creation of a temporary bridge suspended in time between where you are right now and where the book is right now. And both you and the book will continue to move. A more specific example of a conscious reading strategy is the application of a model to the text, the superimposition of a framework that comes from outside of the book. By applying the model, The reader seeks to leverage pre-existing knowledge or a sense of spatial relationships or a sense of internal dynamics in order to wring more meaning or significance from the content of the story. For example, we just read the first chapter of The Hobbit, and the existence of the hill and the water and the smoke rings, right? And then the specter of dragonfire might encourage us to say, Tolkien seems to be setting out a schematic that lines up with the classical elements of air and earth and fire and water. What happens if I read the book and pay really close attention to those things and see how they connect, leaning on my pre-existing understanding of the classical elements and the way that they have traditionally been used in fiction, both literally and thematically? That, by the way, would be a perfectly valid reading strategy, and I would be interested in the results. Alternatively, you might think, Bilbo's birthday is September 22nd, which means that he is a Virgo cusping into Libra. How does that help me understand Bilbo? In what way is he a classic Virgo-Libra cusp? The internet tells me in the preparation of today's episode that people born on September 22nd exhibit qualities of earth and air, like when Bilbo smokes his pipe outside Bag End, OMG, and they desire deep balance, and they often think like a lawyer, which, well, I may have just stumbled into the thesis for a mass-market pop culture book. A word of warning here. A model is a dangerous temptation, because you can make anything into a model. And you can then apply that model to any text you have ever read. How do the members of the Fellowship of the Ring line up against the cast of Scooby-Doo? Who is the Velma? Who is, when you really get down to it, the Fred? Or how do the members of the Fellowship line up against the first-generation starter Pokemon? Someone somewhere could do that analysis. It's very easy to get so tangled in your speculative interpretation that you leave the text behind. If you go into a novel looking for the four horsemen of the apocalypse, or id, ego, superego triads, or all the signs of the zodiac, then you are going to be able to find them if you contort the text enough. It's important to root the instance of the interpretation, the momentary interpretation that you are doing right here, into the narrative and aesthetic effect of the novel, the piece of art. Otherwise, we're just speculating. We're building houses of cards. We're building on insubstantial or even contradictory inferences. That is how you wind up with ring theory, Star Wars fans. So my reading strategy for this journey through The Hobbit is to sidestep the default approach to this book, which is to read it as if it is the first part of the Legendarium, to bring in no external knowledge, to treat it like it is a standalone fairy tale. That is a completely valid approach to this text. It is a strategy that I myself have employed many times before. But it's not the only strategy available, which is why I'm choosing to read The Hobbit this time as a diegetic product of a well-developed secondary world that has deep roots into the Elder Days and the stories of the Silmarillion. All of the Silmarillion is true, and Bilbo is writing this book within that world, which is kind of reflective of where Tolkien himself is as he's writing The Hobbit in the first place. What do we learn by taking that approach? What does that perspective yield to us? How does it work within the framework established for the stories of Beren and Luthien and the children of Húrin and the fall of Númenor? That's what we're going to be paying attention to week by week. And to pivot to the related question from Karina, your reading order is inevitably, or at least should be perhaps, a product of your reading strategy. The chronological default, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion, is completely valid. If you want to see the progression as most people experience it, if you want to have that experience of moving from the juvenile to the adult to the sadly posthumous, then that approach works. In general, I default to a chronologically by publication order for reading, as I've discussed over on Stars and Swords, my general genre fiction podcast, in which I absolutely flouted authorial fiat and started the Narnia books with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I think you can make an argument for reading The Lord of the Rings first and then The Hobbit as a little in-universe bonus episode, and then The Silmarillion. Or you can start with The Silmarillion and then The Hobbit and then The Lord of the Rings, as I'm doing with this particular reading, kind of moving through the diegetic chronology. Also valid, particularly if this isn't your first time through. And obviously, I'm only including the 3 main volumes here. If you, dear listener, have a reading strategy that includes The Fall of Gondolin and Beren and Luthien and the history of Middle-earth, then please let me know. shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. In conclusion, then, adopting a reading strategy, particularly for your own enjoyment, if you're not undertaking a critical approach to the text, adopting a reading strategy is just about making conscious that temporary, fleeting relationship that you have with the book, and trying to meet the book both on its own terms and in a way which will maximize your own enjoyment of the text. Thank you to Sarah and to Karina for the excellent questions. In return, a question of the week for you, dear listener. Follow Shire Reckoning Pod on Instagram and Blue Sky, and you will discover what will become a weekly fiendish prompt this week. This question: if a malevolent genie demands that you recast one member of the Fellowship in the 3 Peter Jackson movies, or all of those movies vanish forever, who would you recast? And for bonus points, which actor circa 1999 or 2000 would you cast instead? Would you trade Sean Bean for Liam Neeson? Would you trade Sir Ian McKellen for Patrick Stewart? Would you switch out Billy Boyd for James McAvoy? Get in touch and let me know your hottest takes. And so, to our almanac. We are still a couple weeks out from things really picking up in Arda, but there are a number of notable events in the life and publication history of Tolkien's work in this upcoming week. July 28th is the anniversary of both the performance of The Ballad of Bilbo Baggins by Leonard Nimoy on the TV show Malibu in 1967, and the single-volume publication of Leaf by Niggle in 2016. One of those two events has definitely aged better than the other. July 29th will be the 71st anniversary of the publication of The Fellowship of the Ring in the UK, with a very modest print run of 3,000 copies, 17 years after the release of The Hobbit. Though sales weren't as good as we might expect from our contemporary perspective, they were still strong. Another 2,600 copies were printed in December. The book sells steadily through the 1950s, but there is a sharp increase in interest in 1960, and that is when the book really takes off. If you are interested in picking up a copy of the first impression of the first edition, the internet tells me that you can get all 3 volumes in near fine condition for the low, low price of $184,000. If you are considering such a purchase, I suggest a 1% finder's fee payable at patreon.com/nextword. Seriously though, the link to that listing is in the show notes. Go and check them out. They are beautiful, beautiful books. And sadly, August 1st will be the anniversary of the death of Pauline Baynes, the artist who contributed so much to our visual sense of Tolkien's work. She starts working with Tolkien in 1949, illustrating Farmer Giles of Ham. Tolkien then recommends her to C.S. Lewis for the illustrations included with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. She goes on to illustrate all the Narnia novels, as well as providing cover art for the 1961 edition of The Hobbit and the 64 slipcase edition of The Lord of the Rings. She also draws, famously, the fantastic art for the Bilbo's Last Song poster, which is published in 1974. Tolkien described her as possessing, quote, great talent for producing vivid and believable pictures while touching them with a delightful air of fantasy, which is largely imported by her fluid and dexterous line, end quote. Baynes sadly passed in 2008. This week, there is a surprising amount of news out of the Tolkien world, including a release date for another new Tolkien book. The Bovdian Fragments, edited by Christopher Tolkien, features parts of a story called The End of Bovadium, an anti-industrial satire set in a version of Oxford. It will be released by HarperCollins on November 18th. Burns & Company, a production company with a history of fairly low-budget, faith-based live-action films, has announced an animated adaptation of the John Hendricks graphic novel The Mythmakers, which is about the friendship between Tolkien and Lewis. No release date or indeed production schedule has been made available so far, but we will stay tuned for more news on that. In scholarship, Adam Roberts, I think, wrote the best thing that I read this week over on his Substack. The usual reservations about recommending a platform which facilitates hate speech are in full effect, but Robert's piece, Goblins, ! Connects the goblins in George MacDonald's The Princess and the Goblin, H.G. Wells's Morlocks in The Time Machine, and Hobbit-era goblins of Tolkien's creation with a wonderfully light touch and a very dexterous turn of linguistic analysis. Highly recommended. Lastly, and forgive my pronunciation here, Marie Bretagnol at Roi Tolkien published a fantastic piece on one of the weirder parts of Tolkien's publication history, specifically Queen Margaret II of Denmark's hand-drawn illustrations for The Lord of the Rings. The link is in the show notes. Definitely check that out. And that is going to do it for this episode of Shire Reckoning. I hope that you can join me live on Tuesday evening at 9 p.m. Central as we get our hands dirty with an analysis of the beginning of Bilbo's adventure in The Hobbit with trolls and talking purses in Chapter 2, Roast Mutton. That's 9 p.m. Central Time, live on YouTube at youtube.com/@ShireReckoningPod. Go subscribe right now and do that little notification bell thing. And don't forget, if you pledge your support over at patreon.com/nextword, if you help me continue to upgrade my studio and simply make more podcasts, then you'll also be invited to join me in the exclusive post-show discussion, Last Call at the Green Dragon, an extra half hour of unstructured, unplanned, unscripted conversation about everything we love in the wide world of Tolkien. As I say, you also support this endeavor and will help me continue to make podcasts for many years to come. That is going to do it for this week's episode of Shire Reckoning. I will be back on Tuesday with Chapter 2 of The Hobbit and next Sunday with more. Until then, thanks for listening.